Hi, Deb Tucker here from Studio 180 Design. This video segment, I'd like to address some of those frequently asked questions that we receive here all the time. The first question, and one of the ones that we receive most often, has to do with my wing clipper tool. Those of you who have it, you know that it makes flying geese units. The flying geese units are oversized and you get to trim them down. The question is, how come I don't have extra fabric on this edge to be able to trim it away? The reason that happens is because when you have the large squares and the small squares that you use to create your units, the natural inclination is to position the raw edges of the small square in direct alignment with the large square. But what you actually want to do when you position those squares is to nudge the square in off the edges just a couple of threads. That doesn't have to be a precise measurement, but it does have to be there because those extra threads that you nudge become the extra threads along this edge and allow you to trim it down easily. Try that with your next flying geese. You're going to be glad you did. This is a question that also comes up in relation to the wing clipper tool and the flying geese. When you go to trim it down, sometimes people will say that their lines aren't quite as accurate as they would like to be. Why does that happen? Well, it happens because when you're at this stage and you're taking these pieces and pressing them out in this direction, if you get heavy-handed, which is something I do on a regular basis, especially if I'm in a hurry, I get a little bowing on that edge. It's a long bias edge, and I get a little bowing on there. When I get that bowing, that's what causes these lines not to line up. So that's where it comes from. I'll talk about that, how to fix that in just a minute. But to fix the unit, what you'd want to do, pressing caused the problem, so I'm going to use pressing to fix the problem. Simply use a warm hot iron and nudge this edge of the piece up just a little bit. Steam will help here, and you're seeing I'm not moving the shape at all, but just by taking the iron and narrowing up the seam, when I go to put this back on there, you're going to see that the lines now perfectly align with the seam lines. To keep that from happening, you probably won't be able to keep it from happening 100% of the time, but when you are at this stage, one of the things that I like to do is I like to spray my pieces with either a sizing or with something like Mary Ellen's Best Press and be a little bit gentler with your pressing. That's going to help keep that misalignment from happening in your future flying geese units. You really won't believe how many times this question comes up at our office. People buy our magic wands. They're great little tools. They're ½ an inch wide. They've got a lasered line down the middle. It's a marking tool that we use for marking ¼ inch seams. When you purchase the tool, they look like this. And people are a little upset because they're thinking, this is what I want and this is what I got. Well, what has happened is these tools that you are receiving have a protective piece of paper on both sides of them so that when you receive them, that paper can be peeled off, revealing that laser line that goes down the middle, and you will have a quilter's magic wand that looks just like the one that you thought you were buying at the beginning. Another question that we're frequently asked is, what's the difference between the Spotlight tool and the corner beam tool? The Spotlight tool was the tool that we introduced first. And after using it for just a few short months, I realized, there were a couple of additional lines that I wanted to put on the ruler for a more refined trim at the end of the process. So we added those lines, changed the name from Spotlight to corner beam, and I'd like to take just a minute to show you what those lines are and how they apply. The Spotlight and corner beam unit will both make a shape that looks like this, which is a square that has two diagonal seams. The cutting of the triangles, the cutting of the center beam, and the first trim that you do is actually exactly the same between the Spotlight and the corner beam. When you go to do that first trim on both tools, what you're doing is lining up the long two diagonal guidelines with the seam lines and trimming and cleaning up that square corner. That's a good thing, and that's the same on both. This is where the change came into place. When I turn the unit around to do that second trim. When I had the spotlight tool, the only thing I had to line up were the two cleanup edges and this little V right down in here. And I decided that what I wanted were two additional lines, and there are additional lines for all the different sizes that you're using. But those two little lines allowed me to do a small adjustment so that I'm getting a more refined cut to the unit every time I'm working with it. So I have the cleanup lines, the V down here, and the additional tick marks that are out on the edge of the ruler with each of the different 11 different sizes, and my unit is a little bit more refined than with the spotlight. But realize, Sue tells me all the time, she has the spotlight and she gets great results with it. So both will work. This one works well. This one works a little bit better. This is a question that revolves around my rapid fire Hunter Star. It's the first tool that I created. Many of you have tried it over the years and you love the process, but when you go to do that final trim down, I hear my lines don't line up perfectly. Well, when you do that final trim down, or when you do the construction of the Hunter Star, it's presumed that you can get some pretty good accurate seams. If your seams are too wide or your seams are too narrow, and it doesn't take much, a thread or two will cause you to not be able to line up the lines on the tool with the lines, the sewing lines that you've made. Well, you line up one and they're off on the other end. My suggestion to you is twofold. First, work on refining those seams so that you get them closer to a true 1/4 of an inch. But the other solution is, if your blocks are already made and you want to use them, simply nudge the tool so that you're finding middle ground. So instead of these lines being lined up perfectly and these lines being off 3 or 4 threads, you're finding middle ground in between. The diagonal stays on the diagonal. And that way, when you trim your blocks, they're going to be pretty close to exactly the same from one to the next, and your quilt is going to still go together beautifully for you. For those of you who've tried my Lemoine star, you realize that this is a great process for putting Lemoine stars together, but a question comes out that when they do the final trim down of a block, the star's not the right size. The points don't fall 1/4 of an inch from the edge. There are a couple of reasons why that happened. The first reason is because when you get to this stage in the construction process, sometimes we get so excited to finish our blocks that we actually forget to use the Lemoine Star tool. We sew these together and our diamonds are too big and we're not going to be able to trim our blocks down at the end to the correct size. So my first suggestion is, don't forget about the Lemoine Star tool, putting it on your diamonds after they're pieced and trimming them to the right size. If you do that and your star points still aren't where they need to be, what has happened is that your accurately trimmed pieces are being sewn together with seams that are too wide or too narrow. So if you're doing the trimming and your star isn't the correct size at the end, you need to work on refining the size of your seam allowance to a truer 1/4 of an inch seam. Try that and you're going to be finding pieces will fit much better for you in the end. Having been a quilter for more than 30 years, I realize that a good ironing surface is a valuable asset to any person's sewing room. I've tried lots of different ironing boards, but I'll tell you, the one that I like the most is one that I actually make myself. The ironing board that I like is a piece of plywood. You can go to your local home improvement center. They can get a pre-cut piece of plywood. This one happens to be 2 feet by 4 feet. You can get one up to 2 feet by 6 feet, which is plenty big enough to be able to iron a whole wide piece of fabric all at the same time. Once I get my plywood home, I put a single layer of 100% cotton batting on top of there. Sometimes I'll spray glue it to keep it in place, but you want to make sure to use 100% cotton batting because you don't want any melting to happen. So no polyester underneath. Then cover that surface with a canvas with a heavy-duty cotton twill, and once you've got it covered, simply take the piece, wrap it around, and staple gun it to the back of your plywood shape, your plywood board. Just like that, you've got a hard ironing surface that's going to give you maximum effects, great effects, when you do your pressing in your own quilting studios. Give it a try. You know, at some point or another, if you're doing piecework, you are going to have an accurate 1/4 of an inch seam. 30 years of trying all different types of ways to get 1/4 of an inch seam, buying different presser feet and using different gadgets, I come back to this good old tried and true method that I want to share with you here today. It's a masking tape seam guide. I set this up for all my beginners when they're first learning how to quilt. This is how I work through the process. You are going to stack up about 5 to 6 layers of masking tape. Let's put them on a cutting board when you're doing that. It needs to be 5 or 6 layers. Don't skimp. Not 1 or 2, because what I need is an edge. After I've stacked up my layers of masking tape, don't presume that the edge is straight. I never can, even with 30 years of practice. To make sure that I have a straight edge, I'm going to take a regular ruler and my rotary cutter and cut a very long, clean edge on the masking tape. There's one more step that I have to do in order to be able to put this masking tape under my presser foot and onto my sewing machine, and that's to take an X-Acto knife and make a couple little cuts so that I can cut out a notch out of that cleaned up edge so that you have a little space that's going to allow your presser foot to sit down flat on the throat plate when you set this up on your machine. So give me a second, we'll get the machine in place, and I'll show you how to make this masking tape guide work for you. Now I've finished my masking tape guide. There's one more step that I have to do to be able to set this accurate 1/4 of an inch seam up, and that's to use a piece of graph paper. I like to use graph paper that's a high quality graph paper, so don't buy it at the local grocery store. Go to a good office supply store, get a nice piece of graph paper, take a scissor or a rotary cutter and clean up one of the edges right on one of the lines, and then your focus point is going to be the next line that is a 1/4 of an inch in from the edge of the graph paper. And this is what we're going to do to make that masking tape and that graph paper align and set up your 1/4 of an inch seam. I'm going to take the graph paper, put it under my machine, and you can do this with your machine threaded or unthreaded. Mine is unthreaded here, and I'm putting the needle down directly into the first line of the graph paper. You can put your presser foot down to hold it into place. This is where my masking tape seam guide is going to come into play. The little notch is going to go right around the presser foot so that I'm not having the presser foot ride on the masking tape at all. But I'm going to nestle and nudge the masking tape right up against the edge of the graph paper. And before I remove the graph paper, I'm going to do one more test. Just take your sewing machine and give it a run. Gently push the graph paper up against, and you're going to see that you've got stitches that are at a good true 1/4 of an inch. I'll tell you what, when you do this, you're going to want to have this on your machine forever. You will, if you have a top-loading machine, have to remove the masking tape in order to be able to refill your bobbin. So you'll see that underneath here, I don't know whether you saw it at the beginning, but there was a line mark there. And I put that line on there so that if I have to lift up the masking tape, I can very easily reposition it. But it takes just a minute to use your graph paper and reposition this for a very good, true 1/4 of an inch seams. It just takes a minute or two to set this up, and you're going to be on your way to better, more accurate 1/4 of an inch seams on all of your quilting projects. In conclusion, if you want to become a better quilter, there are a couple words of advice that I like to live by. First is, buy the best quality tools that are on the market. Buy the best supplies that you can afford. Good quality fabric, good quality thread are going to make good quilts. Continue to learn as much as you can about as many different ways as you can to build your quilts. And remember to practice. And then practice some more and practice some more. You know, it's never going to make us perfect, but it will make you better.